Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's policy seminar, The Political Economy of COVID-19, Impacts on Agriculture and Food Policies. I'm Katarla Taylor, Events Manager at IFPRI, and I will moderate today's event. Thank you for joining this virtual event live, and thank you to those of you who will watch this recording. We are eager to hear from you. To participate in our Q&A session that will follow the brief presentations, please go to IFPRI's website, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, or use the hashtag AskIFPRI. We will come to all of your questions once the presentations are done, and we would like to hear from as many of you as possible. So in submitting your questions, please also identify yourself with your name and your affiliation. The economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting pressures on public finances and donor resources are necessitating stark trade-offs among different policy priorities within the agriculture sector and across the food system. In what ways has the pandemic altered the balance of power among urban and rural populations, the state and private sector, and across government ministries? Today's seminar will examine how these issues are playing out and have played out across Africa, in India, Chile, and in the US. We have an excellent panel lined up for you, and I will now call on our first speaker, Johan Swinnen, IFPRI's Director General.
Thank you very much, Katarla. I'm really pleased to sit here today to be able to introduce this seminar and this issue. As you know, or as you might know, I have done a lot of work on political economy in my career, and I'm very much intrigued still today by these issues. We have a packed agenda today with many experts, so I will keep my opening remarks to identifying some of what I see as the key issues, and I look forward to learning from the speakers on this panel. We have a wide regional focus, as Qatar already identified. We have people who will speak about rich country responses to the COVID-19, particularly Joe Glauber on the US policies, on emerging countries in Latin America, and on developing countries in South Asia and in Africa. Now, why are we having this seminar? Now, we know from research on political economy that changes in welfare and incomes, the distribution of income, typically affects policies because it affects the pressure, the lobbying that people do, the pressure that's put on the political systems, people's political reactions versus what people can invest in political actions rather than invest in economic actions. And these things are typically affected by big shocks in welfare and in the environment. This can lead to the changes in existing policies. For example, tariffs can be reduced or can be increased, subsidies can be changed. It can lead to the introduction of new regulations, or it can lead to the removal of old or existing regulations. So we should expect changes. Now, the nature of what is happening, the nature of the shock matters as well. We can have gradual changes, and something like one could argue that climate change, for example, is something that moves more gradually compared to the COVID shock that we have today, which really is a shock to the health system, to the economic system, and as we will argue, or as I will argue, to the political system as well. Now, we know that COVID is affecting the economy and the food security of the people in two ways. It affects both the people's welfare and the food security to the impact on the economy by declining incomes, declining employment, etc. It also affects them by disrupting our food systems, our value chains. And so both of these effects will also play probably a role in the political scene. And so shocks are crucial for trade. Why are shocks important compared to gradual changes, or why does it matter? Because if you want to have a big change, I mean, going from one policy system to another, for example, that typically requires a shock to trigger, if you want, the political economy equilibrium. We know that from several cases, probably one of the earliest, which is well described, is in the late 19th century. There were, when industrial production of food took off, industrial production, the Industrial Revolution was possible with scientific innovation, but these scientific innovations also led to the capacity of scientists to actually analyze what was in the food, in the industrially produced food. And what did they find? Well, there was all kinds of things in this industrially produced food which was not supposed to be in there. It was sometimes cheap substitute, but sometimes it was poisonous as well. This triggered, it really shocked the political economy, and it led to a whole series of food safety regulations throughout the world. This is the first set of food safety regulation at the late 19th, early 20th century. In Europe, another major shock to some of these regulations occurred in the late 20th century. In the 1990s, we had several food safety crises taking place in the EU, and this again shocked the system and led to a whole set of new food safety legislations, and a lot of these are affecting global value chains today. Another example is what happened in 2007, 2008, when food prices spiked on global world markets, affecting consumers and producers throughout the world. This again shocked the political system and led to big changes in agriculture and food policies that followed in the years afterwards. Today is a bit different, I think, or significantly different from 2000, from the price spikes in the 2000s, for a number of reasons. Well, what is similar is it also shocks the system, the political economy system. But in 2007, 2008, and the years afterwards, producers and consumers were affected very differently. Consumers were hurt by much higher food prices, but many producers actually benefit. Today, it's different because both producers and consumers are negatively affected generally. Today, we also have a much more bigger disruption of our food system, which we did not, or had to a lesser extent, in the late 2000s. And this has caused an increase of attention to things like food systems, the sustainability of food systems, the resilience of food systems, etc. And these issues have been rising on the priority list, on the policy agenda in already this year, and I expect in the coming years as well. It also brought back an issue to policy discussions on the role of global and local food supply chains. And this has been something which has been part of the debate, the policy debate, for a long time. But clearly what's happening with COVID is raising this issue again and bringing it back to a higher level of policy attention. What we have seen similar initially in terms of policy reactions to between the 2007-2008 food price spikes and today's effect is the policy reactions in terms of trade policy. Initially, several food exporting countries had introduced export restraints, just like they did in 2008, 2009, etc. What's interesting is that the policy community has responded to that very strongly on this. For example, IFPRI researchers and Joe Glauber, who's going to speak, took an important role in this, but also WTO, FAO specialists all said, well, this is a very inefficient way of dealing with this, and please stop with that. And there's been an interesting response from the policy community, or say from policymakers all over the world, that many of these restrictions have gone. There's also been a lot of trade policy interventions which have been introduced for health reasons, to control basically people moving or commodities moving, etc., for health reasons. And Danielle Resnick, for example, has done a lot of work documenting these things in Africa and the impact that these have had. As I said already, shocks typically create openings for bold reforms of policy, much bigger, much more important ones than is possible otherwise. And so today we will hear from a number of specialists to discuss how this has happened or not happened in their country. And so I'm really looking forward, for example, the intervention by Ashok Gulati, because Ashok has been arguing that the important reforms which have been introduced this year in the past months in India, and which people are speculating may have a major impact on agricultural growth in the future, were only possible because of COVID-19. Well, I'm going to let Ashok make the point himself. Okay, this is how I interpret some of the things he's been saying. On rich countries, see in the EU, there are two major policy innovations being introduced this year. One is the Green Deal, which affects almost all policy making in Europe. And the other one this week on the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, which affects almost $400 billion, which will be spent in the next year. And so the question there is, did COVID play a role in this, or were these just factors which were already there and COVID really did not have that much of an impact? Similar questions, I think, relate to what's happening in the USA. And this is where Joe will talk about, Joe Glauber, because there we've seen also significant developments in policy initiatives over the past year. And so there the question is, was this triggered by COVID, or was it triggered by other factors, such as being in an electoral year, the conflict with China, etc.? And we can raise similar questions on what's been happening in Africa and Latin America. And Carlos Surge, Sam Benin, and Astrid Haas, and Danielle as well will talk about this. So I'm really looking forward to answers to these very important questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jo. Our next speaker is Danielle Resnick, Senior Research Fellow and Governance Theme Leader at IFPRI. Danielle, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Katarla. So as Jo was alluding to, crises very much create a window of opportunity for reform, but they very much test the ability of governments to manage and reconcile different interests and to weigh off different priorities. And of course, political economy dynamics often underlie the outcomes of these difficult balancing acts, which have become quite unprecedented during the current pandemic. So the subsequent presentations are going to delve into these dynamics into a lot more detail, but my job is to essentially set the scene in which to contextualize each of their interventions. So if we go to the next slide, we can see here we have 4 different sets of actors. And if we start up on the left-hand side, we can think about administrative actors, which are quite key in the political economy process. These can include ministries, decentralized units, marketing boards, other types of government procurement agencies, actors within the bureaucracy. And their major incentive is to ensure that they have resources, particularly in the budget process, and to retain relevance, even as government priorities may change over time. On the upper right-hand side, we then have various political actors, political parties, mayors, governors, presidents, legislatures. What they want is to secure power, maintain office, and gain attribution from voters for their actions, for their responsiveness. On the bottom right-hand side, we can think of various societal interest groups, including unions, cooperatives such as farmers' cooperatives, activists, and other types of lobbyists. And their goal is, of course, to gain access to these political and administrative actors and thereby influence the outcomes of the policy process. And then lastly, on the lower left-hand side, we can think of various external actors, donors, the WTO, which Jo was just alluding to, various transnational networks. And they aim to provide leverage to governments in order to meet their development objectives, perhaps through financial leverage, but they can also offer legitimacy, particularly offering legitimacy to the goals of domestic interest groups who are struggling to have their voice heard by their governments. So with this framing in mind, I want to turn to what I see as 4 impacts of COVID-19 on food and ag policies that have had political economy dynamics. I think first, with travel bans, border closures, and other types of lockdowns, there's been a lot of rethinking about the vulnerability of supply chains and the role of market intermediaries, and thinking about ways to make supply chains more efficient. So in some cases, it's led to the acceptance of strong interest groups to new ways of doing business. We can think of Sri Lanka, where for more than 18 years, they were trying to move the weekly in-person tea auction to an online interface. But there was a lot of opposition from tea associations and tea brokers. But with the pandemic, within just a few months in early April, they were able to shift their incentives. They saw the value of doing this, and an online auction has now been established. There's, of course, the other case of India, for example, where there has been some resistance to government reform efforts, where farmers could now sell directly to private markets rather than directly to government wholesale markets at assured floor prices. There's been some opposition from political parties and farmers groups, and we're looking forward to Ashok Gulati to provide us a more in-depth discussion of this fascinating case study. The second major impact of COVID-19 has certainly been with respect to the reduced fiscal space for agriculture. There's obviously some concern that this health crisis may balloon into a debt crisis, especially for the more than 30 low-income countries that are at high risk of debt distress. And since this crisis is also affecting development economies, it's undoubtedly going to restrict the amount of donor resources, including for agriculture. So this suggests that fiscal resources for the sector could be severely constrained. And so Sam Bainin is really going to look at what this means for agricultural investment goals under the AU's CAADP commitments. And Carlos Furche will look at some of these similar dynamics in the Latin American context. With scarcer resources, of course, their distribution becomes more intensely contested, and stronger interest groups typically are more likely to benefit. And here, Joe Glauber is going to discuss this more with relation to the US and the massive levels of subsidies that farmers have received here. The third impact of COVID-19 has very much been an increase in food aid. Food aid has been the main social protection response we've seen many governments take to support the food security, particularly of the poor. But there has been more than 600 protests globally about food and food relief efforts, particularly around the targeting, quality and quantity of these efforts. A lot of the food aid distribution has been politicized in many places. In Bangladesh, for example, outrage over the corruption in food relief distributions perpetuated by local political elites. In other cases, there has been concern about the political attribution of this food relief distribution. Members of parliament for the opposition in Zimbabwe, for example, have been arrested for distributing food relief to the poor. Similar dynamics have occurred in the Gambia. And then in Honduras, quite a lot of protest over beliefs that food aid is being just distributed to allies of the ruling elite. These trends can be particularly pronounced in countries that are facing elections during this pandemic period. And this is where Astrid Haas's interventions, particularly on Uganda, will be quite illuminating. And then I think fourth and finally, I think what's quite different about this crisis is that unlike the other 3 points I just mentioned, we have seen those other 3 dynamics in previous crises, both financial and food crisis. But I think that what's different here is that we're seeing more weight to new actors in the policy sphere, especially renewed attention to micro and small enterprises and informal actors, particularly informal food traders. Informal food traders are typically quite marginalized in their political space. In many cases, there's regulations against street vending and hawking, but the pandemic has definitely put their vulnerability into stark light. And we have seen countries from Burkina Faso to India instituting social protection to particularly support this group. In places even like China, there's been a rethinking of regulations against street hawkers and a policy to support a street vendor economy. So in this way, we can see that the pandemic has created some windows of opportunity for new interest groups to gain more recognition in the policy sphere, especially supported by transnational civil society networks that lobby on behalf of informal labor rights. So with this framing, I'm going to turn back to Katarla so that the panelists can provide us with more details on these different issues. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, for setting the scene for us. I will now call on Ashok Gulati, InfoSci's Chair Professor for Agriculture at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Ashok, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katarla, and pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel. What I would like to put on the table is from where you started, that such global shocks offer a window of opportunity for major changes. Everyone knows how India took a different direction in economic reforms in 1991. That was not a global crisis, it was Indian crisis, and it gave a different shape to India's economic policies. But the COVID has given a global shock, and to feed a country of 1.38 billion people, it was a challenge. At the notice of just 4 hours, the Prime Minister announced that everything is going to be shut down at midnight. And the issue that was on 24th of March, and from 1st of April, massive procurement season starts in the country that has to feed the country throughout the year. We have one of the largest public distribution systems in the world. 800 million people get highly subsidized food, basically wheat and rice. So wheat procurement had to start from 1st of April. And there were concerns of social distancing because thousands of farmers thrown into those so-called APMC markets, which are regulated by the government. And if people come there, they will catch all this COVID virus, and there could be a disaster. So government said, we are suspending the APMC laws, and we are asking anybody can go to the farmers directly or any other place to buy, so that you don't create chaos in those APMC markets. And that particular experiment as a pilot turned out to be extremely useful. India landed up procuring 39 million tons of wheat during the lockdown period when all things were shut down except the essentials. And government found that this system works better than the system they had. So they issued ordinances to change the rules of the game, what you call in your system administrative institutional reforms. And they said, okay, we are asking now and liberating the agriculture markets, which were more designated farmers and big buyers have to come to APMC markets. Now anybody can go to the farmers. They need not pay mandi fee or taxes and commissions on that, and which count depending upon the commodity anywhere from 5% to 10%, even sometimes more. So they found that system to be working much better. Now, when these ordinances were brought to the parliament, they got it through with a lot of commotion and a lot of opposition from many of the political parties, but finally they are the law of the land. Only yesterday, Punjab, one of the states, has come up with its own laws opposing this and trying to say that we want to have a different system because their produced wheat and rice, more than 90%, 95% is already bought by the government. So they don't want it to go outside because they put 8.5% taxation on it, which comes to them. So from the center to the state, it's an issue of more resources. But I consider this particular major change in the Indian agriculture marketing system that has fed the country much better than the earlier system. It will create much better and efficient value chains in the system. And I have compared it with 1991 structural reforms of the country, so-called the de-licensing of the industry. So this is like de-licensing of the agriculture marketing system. My hope is that within 3 to 5 years, there will be hundreds and thousands of startups. You talked about online systems. There are already about 500 startups are in this game of setting up extremely good value chains. So this is, to me, a transformational step. It will take a little time for the system to pick it up and then show how efficiency can be brought in. And I think India will emerge, Indian agriculture, much more competitive on this ground. We have remained, despite all this COVID, this year India again will be the largest exporter of rice, and quite a bit of that rice goes to African countries. So in a way, we are keeping not only our food supply lines alive, but also supporting food security lines in Africa. So from that angle, I consider this as a major step in the right direction. It has disturbed the comfort zone of many commission agents who used to charge high commissions, and some states who used to get a lot of revenue from the central government by putting taxes and making actually economically inefficient system. So those interest groups have been impacted, and but Indian system, they have not demolished the existing system. They have only offered the alternatives. So the two systems, the old and the new, will have to compete. And unless they become efficient, one of them will have to gradually give way. It's not going to be a 0-1 game overnight, but a gradual change will come in. And these laws of bypassing the APMC Mandi law, what we call, or what also is the direct contract farming law. Milk in India is a classic example of smallholders. 187 million tons we produce, and this is being produced by all the smallholders of the country. Basically, it's a contract farming that is going on with millions of farmers and cooperatives. So if you have to improve the landscape of this to get the best results, Prime Minister has already announced 10,000 FPOs, farmer producer organizations, an agriculture infrastructure fund of 1 lakh crores of rupees, and asymmetry in terms of information will have to be removed, and that's where digitalization of the economy will give much better results. So once you complete in this puzzle the missing parts of it, and then I'm sure in the next 3 years, you will start seeing very good results and a takeoff of Indian agriculture with better returns to farmers, more efficiency in trade, and overall, I think good for the country. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashok. A reminder to all of you tuning in that we will be coming to the Q&A portion of the program shortly. And so you can please continue to submit your questions on IFPRI's various social media platforms. But up next is Sam Benin, IFPRI's Deputy Division Director of the Africa Regional Office. Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Katala. If you're in my time zone, it is dawn and still dark outside, but many thanks for joining us for this from wherever you are. As you may know or have heard, response to the COVID-19 pandemic has and will result in higher government expenditures or foregone revenue, which impacts the fiscal space for undertaking critical public investment. So my plan is to look at some of the evidence of this in Africa vis-a-vis implementing the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, or CAADP. Next slide, please. African countries are using or plan to use different fiscal policies to deal with the health effects and socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We can analyze these policies by looking at the different channels, targets, or instruments, as it is shown in Figure 1 on the slide. The health sector is fundamental in these policies, and so I will not speak much to it, but other sectors too have been targeted, especially the tourism and hoteling sectors, which have taken a big hit because of the lack of travel. And several countries too have stated specific support to the agriculture sector, deeming that it is important to keep the food system going. The bulk of the instruments used were for reducing, postponing payment or installment payment of various taxes, fees, utility bills, etc. And in some of the countries, there were specific specifications, including transfers to the informal business sector, vulnerable households, and those that were laid off. And as I mentioned earlier, these policies result in higher government expenditures of foregone revenue, which is estimated at about 1% of gross domestic product, or GDP, or about $32 billion for Africa. As Figure 2 shows, few countries in their supplementary budgets that they put out to combat in response to the COVID-19 pandemic have indicated how they plan to finance these costs. Although analysis presented by the IMF shows that the fiscal space for managing the cost is very limited, as the cost is outweighed by the available resources for Africa, but also for other countries, especially those in the low income developing, as well as the emerging countries, as it is shown in figure 3. Next slide, please. This is concerning for implementing the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program and also for achieving the goals of the Malabo Declaration on accelerated agricultural growth and transformation for shared prosperity and improved livelihoods in Africa. This, as you can see in the Figure 4, the fiscal space was improved between 2000 and 2007 as African countries reduced their debts. But since then, the space has been shrinking as debt has been rising. Africa's debt is now at about 60% of GDP. Consequently, debt servicing or interest payment is high and rapidly rising, which is crowding out critical public investment in agriculture and infrastructure and other economic functions. And you can see this from the charts in figure 5. So whilst expenditure is rising, overall, total government expenditure is rising, you can see that the shares going to infrastructure and agriculture and other economic functions is declining. But spending in agriculture is already low, as you can see from the figure, which is less than 1% of GDP per year. And if you add this to the spending on infrastructure and other economic functions, it is much lower than what is spent on debt, servicing the debt, or in going to interest payments. Prior to COVID-19 too, we see that the progress in implementing CAADP and the Malabo Declaration has also slowed down. And so the idea is that with spending on the sector also declining and also on other critical investments declining, then to get back on track in terms of progress in implementing CAADP and also the Malabo Declaration is already a concern. And you can see that many countries that were on track in terms of implementing the program, when looking at the baseline values, really were off track in the second BR in 2019. And you can see that no country actually was on track with respect to the targets for enhancing agricultural investment, which includes the government putting at least 10% of the expenditures in the sector. And so the COVID-19 pandemic poses a major threat to implementing CAADP. Next slide, please. So to close, how can African governments increase their fiscal space and help build back better after the COVID-19 pandemic? The answers or recommendations are not new. They also cannot be overemphasized. But let me focus on the first 3 points on the slide. The main thing here, though, is about increasing the efficiency of spending by reallocating and also ramping up investment in critical areas such as agricultural R&D, extension, infrastructure, and education, because these have long-term productivity and growth effects, and that they can help mitigate or reduce the impact of shocks overall, but also help facilitate more effective and efficient ways of responding to shocks when they occur. If you look at the figure on ODA, you can see that overall ODA has been declining. ODA, the official development assistance to Africa, has been declining, but you can see that more of the ODA is being directed to emergency response, giving an indication that either the shocks are increasing over the years, but the idea is to redirect more resources into helping to prevent or minimize the shocks and also help fight shocks better, rather than increasing emergency response. Another is also broadening the revenue base and increasing the efficiency of revenue collection. Here, a critical action is bringing in more of the informal sector into the formal sector, but not from the myopic perspective of just to tax the informal sector, which often when we talk about broadening the revenue base by bringing in the informal sector seems to be the case. But rather, it is to help support the informal sector to gain access to, for example, the technologies and also the financial facilities in the formal sector that can help them increase their productivity and help them grow, and also to contribute more to employment. Because through these avenues is where the revenue base can be broadened and as well as increased to provide more resources for fighting the shocks, but also for undertaking the critical investments that I talked about, especially in terms of agricultural R&D, extension, education, roads, etc. As these have been shown in many countries and regions and consistently over time to have the bigger bang for the buck in terms of promoting more growth and also sustaining development. So let me end here and thank you for listening. Over to you, Katala.
Thank you so much, Sam. Our next speaker is Astrid Haas, who is the Policy Director at the International Growth Center. Astrid, over to you.
Thank you, Katala, and thanks for the invite. So my intervention is going to be from the urban perspective. And what I'm going to argue is that COVID-19 for urban Africa, including the city where I'm from and where I live, Kampala, Uganda, has played out less as a health crisis and more as an economic crisis, and that has manifested itself in food. And that was actually recognized this year by this year's Nobel Peace Prize for the World Food Programme and its role in being able to sort of manage the food part of the crisis. So Uganda, I forgot to look at the exact statistics, but we've just got over the 10,000 mark for number of COVID-19 cases, and we are still under the 100 mark for the number of deaths. I think we're somewhere around 97 deaths as a result of COVID-19. However, we went into one of the most stringent lockdowns that across the globe, not just in Africa, across the globe, at a very early stage, just after we had the first confirmed case of COVID-19. Now, why has it played out as a food crisis? So as I said, I'm going to use Kampala as an example, but there's many other cities in Africa where this is illustrated in the same way. And the reason is the structure of the urban economy. So in 2016, the World Bank, together with the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, undertook a census of informal sector firms. Now, the informal sector makes up the majority of firms in Kampala, but also in many other African cities. And they found at that time that these firms are really small. In fact, nearly 60% of them were single-person businesses. And already in 2016, 93% of these informal sector firms that they surveyed were operating at or just or very close to the poverty line. So what happened in lockdown? Well, in lockdown, they weren't able to earn any income because most of these firms are in the service sector and most of their work relies on face-to-face interaction, and that wasn't able to happen. And so when you lose your income, this is a big challenge for many of these firms because further surveys have shown that 60%, particularly of the poorest informal sector traders, actually spend their money on food. 60% of their income goes to food. So if you don't have the income, you can't buy the food. Now, Uganda Uganda is a very food abundant country. We have, very, very green, but we don't benefit from large urban agriculture because we don't have the land in our very rapidly growing city to be able to feed all the people that it needs to feed, nor do we have the tenure that would allow that to happen. And there's various arguments pro and against urban agriculture, but in our context, it just wouldn't feed it wouldn't meet the needs of the city. So we have, in the process of the last couple of months in Uganda, already eroded nearly 10 years of poverty eradication efforts. But I think what is most interesting in terms of this discussion is the balance of the rise in poverty. And actually the sharpest rise in poverty has happened in Kampala, the main city. And this, as I said, was reflected in increasing levels of hunger, but also increasing levels of child malnutrition, which we haven't seen for a long time. During the lockdown, the government looked at food aid as a stopgap measure. And they decided that it was only going to be for Kampala. And this raised a lot of political questions because Kampala is an opposition stronghold in a relatively single party country. And also there was a lot of MPs who said, but why do they get the food aid when we have poor people around the country as well? And the president came out very strongly and said, well, this food aid is meant to be for the people who've become poor as a result of the lockdown, not the people who were poor before. It was also the case, and it only reminded me when Danielle, you gave your framing comments, that food aid was only allowed to be distributed by the government. And in fact, you could get arrested and put into prison if you were found to be distributing food aid. Now, the challenges with food aid in an emergency situation like we found ourselves in are multifold. So there's the rapid large-scale procurement question. There's the how do you distribute safely in a pandemic question. Ashok mentioned some of the challenges of bringing large groups of people together. But I think very interestingly, in the case of a city and this focus on the newly poor is, how do you identify the newly poor? These are the ones who are largely invisible in the data. In the end, I think census data was used, or household data was used from previous years to identify which areas of the cities were poorest. But again, how do you identify the poor? And who identifies who's become poor, and how do they qualify? And these are all questions that the government had to grapple with in a very intense and very short period of time. But I think one of the pieces that I want to bring to this is that the food aid and the sort of stopgap measure that was there is not just about the acute short-term piece. We don't know when we're going to get a vaccine. We don't know when cases are going to spike. Uganda just opened its borders again 2 weeks ago. So we just are starting to get people coming over the borders again. So we don't know how the health profile is going to develop, et cetera. We don't know whether we're going to need to go down another lockdown. But food policies are going to be core to managing how we are going to be able to survive this current pandemic wave and the economic crisis that are associated. And certain ideas that, I want to throw out there are some things to do with the role of rural safety nets. So we've seen in previous crises that were mentioned in Joswin's sort of opening remarks, that often a time when an economic crisis hits, particularly in a place like Uganda, people move from urban to rural areas. In Africa, people have a house in the city often and a home in the village. And they moved that way because they can grow their food in the village and they can eat and they can do that. That wasn't possible in this crisis because, as in India, the lockdown was announced very, not quite as rapidly as in India, but quite at a very short notice. But the question is, even if that had been possible, how do you transport people to rural areas safely? How do you ensure that surveillance in rural areas is appropriate? But I think there is something about where in places where social safety nets are because of the close of the limited fiscal space that Samuel, you were talking about, social safety nets are not, from government social safety nets are not an open option. We think about what safety nets we have. The second is the role of the rural of the informal sector. Danielle has written a lot about this, but I think this has really come to light in this. It's both what their role is in supplying food for the poorest in the city, and how do we enable them to do that? And they've always been a very politicized sector, but even more so that now we find ourselves in a pandemic, and in the case of my own country, as well as in an election year. And the third thing is, how do we make ourselves more resilient as a city, and how do we build up to be able to ensure that the process of acquiring food can happen safely? A lot of focus was on this during the lockdown, but now revenues have fallen, government revenues have fallen, particularly city revenues have fallen too. So who's going to upgrade the markets? Who's going to make them safe? And the final point I want to conclude on is, and this is, we've been looking at this in the data. At the beginning of the lockdown, it was a question of supply and disrupted supply chains. And here, I do very much commend my own government and others on actually having pretty quickly managed to get the supply chains up and running again and ensuring that those were running even during the lockdown. But the longer term problem, and the one that we also see in the data now, particularly as lockdowns have been lifted, and this is again not only Kampala but for many other cities, is how do we stimulate aggregate demand? How do all those people who haven't been earning money for a large period of time now be able to start earning money if no one can buy their goods? And therefore, how can they afford their food? How can they afford the food for their families? And what happens if we have to lock down again, or if we have to go into some sort of semi-lockdown? How do we cater for them? And this problem of depressed aggregate demand, I think, is our much more longer term issue that we also have to grapple with, because we are also in a global economic crisis, which has its further effects. So I started with a Nobel Prize, so let me just finish on a Nobel Prize winner. Amartya Sen was the one who said, hunger is not usually a result of inefficient supply. It's about political constructs that mean what the most vulnerable are able to access and when they're able to access what they need. And I think for me, particularly when we think about urban food systems, that should be the sort of, that to me is the crux of the core of the thinking as we think about the pandemic and what we can learn moving forward.
Great, thank you, Astrid. Our next speaker is Carlos Furche, who is the former Minister of Agriculture of Chile between 2014 and 2018, and the former Director of the Agricultural Development Economic Division of FAO between 2018 and 2019. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon. It depends on where you are. First of all, I would like to put some reflections about the situation in Chile, and during the final of the presentation, some reflections about other countries in Latin America. Please, next. In case of Chile, the global impact of the pandemic crisis is reflected, of course, in the general GDP situation, with some low about 5 or 6%, and in the sectoral case, about 3 or 4%. But probably the main issue about the impacts are the increase of unemployment. In agriculture is about 4 to 8, but in general economy is about 15 to 20%, and it's a very high level that in the case of Chile is the first time in the last 30 years or something. And in the case of the agricultural sector, I think the other consequence is the increase of rural poverty. Rural poverty, and in general, the poverty in the country has been reducing consistently during the last 30 years. But I think for the first time in this period, it will increase both in general, but especially in the rural sector, from 17 to 20 or maybe 25%. And the other issue that I think is remarkable is that for the first time in the last year, the food insecurity will also increase from 3% to 5% according to the last information provided for FAO. It means that about 1 million people, Chile has about 20 million people inhabitants, about 1 million people will suffer some kind of food insecurity. Next, please. But coming back to the agri-food system, I think it's remarkable that during the crisis, the operation of the domestic consumption chains has been basically normal. It is because the agriculture sector has been defined as essential sector. I think the efforts of the public support has been oriented to keep financial flows, especially to small agriculture. Small agriculture is very important to provide the daily food that people consume. And we have a number of public policies to support the most vulnerable families, both with cash transfers and also to distributing food boxes. And I think it's necessary to put one first reflection, that is, without food or feed, it's not possible to maintain the lockdowns or the measures to protect population for avoiding the sanitary crisis. So first conclusion, we need feed. Second, without feed and without health, it's not possible economic recovery. So in my opinion, for the next time, both public health and food support, food production, food distribution will be in a more important level of the public debate on the local agenda or political agenda. And Chile has another condition that is an important exporter of fresh fruits and vegetables. I think the main driver for the agriculture sector in Chile is the export sector. So we are now starting the sport season, the more strong sport season, and it will depend heavily on the transport facilities, maritime and air transportation. On the ports operation, I think this is very important because when the crisis starts, the ports, for example, in China, present a lot of problems and difficulties, and it was severe consequences for the exports sector in Chile. And I think we need to pay attention in eventual additional regulations in biosecurity. We have some examples, for example, in the next weeks, in the last weeks in China, with some export, salmon and other products that I think it is a threat that some eventual administrative decisions could affect the normal flow of the international export chain. Next one, please. What will be the main issues for the next time? I think, like the colleagues in Africa have shown, that one, of course, will be the reducing in the public resources in general. We will have severe fiscal restrictions. So the dispute for these scarce resources will be heavy. And of course, in the case of agriculture in a country like Chile, it will be very difficult to keep a reasonable amount of resources to support agriculture, and mainly small agriculture. Probably the priority, because of the employment priority, will have to construction and services and others. So this is the first problem for the next time. Second one, probably we will show or see some heavy pressure to relax or reduce environmental regulations because of the necessity of promote private investments, public investments to reduce the unemployment levels. So I would like to put attention in this issue. Another one is that probably we will suffer some downturn in demand, domestic and external, and it could affect the price levels, mainly in international demand more than in local demand. And I would like also to remark the threatening that we are suffering with some trade protectionism. For example, in this moment in the United States are discussing some measures about very important export production from Chile, mainly berries, blueberries and raspberries. So this could be a problem for the next future. And last one, that I think we will have a new regulation in terms of public health concerns. As we know, more of the casualties of this pandemic crisis affect overweight and obese people. So I can imagine that in the next time we will have some kind of new regulations to promote more healthy food system production. And I think, I will conclude, the most important challenge for the future will be the resources, will be the environmental and sustainable regulation for agriculture sector, and will be trade and protection is about trade, and will be new regulations to promote more healthy food systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Our final speaker before we come to Q&A is Joseph Glauber, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Katarla. And I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. Like other countries that we've heard discussed thus far, the U.S. also has been has been hit hard by the pandemic, with a lot of disruptions in supply chain, a lot of disruptions with labor, a lot of disruptions caused by the quarantines and other lockdown procedures put in place. I think, unlike a lot of other countries, the U.S. has intervened on behalf of producers with some very, very large subsidy programs, which I'd like to discuss today. I think that these are, again, many of the developed countries have had put in place some remedial measures to help their producers, but the magnitude of what the U.S. has done, I think, over the last 6-7 months is quite large. Next slide. So since the COVID, over $23 billion has either been paid out or will be paid out to producers to help compensate for some of the damages and some of the price drops that we've seen. There's been a lot of hard-hit sectors, certainly with lockdown procedures. Pretty much no one was driving their cars, so gasoline consumption plummeted, which also meant things like ethanol production also plummeted. And so corn prices were very low. The problems in the meat processing sector, I think, have been widely reported, and which saw higher prices at the retail level, but very, very low prices at the producer level. And then also problems with sporadic problems with COVID outbreaks for farm laborers and things like that affect fruit and vegetable harvests and those prices. So we've seen about $10.3 billion paid out under the first round of this coronavirus food assistance program. Again, spread between a lot of crops, and not just the traditional crops that receive farm program payments, but also it's gone out to livestock producers and specialty crop producers, so fruits and vegetables and others have received payments. And now, just announced over about a month ago, and now we're in our second week or so of payments, a new round which will pay out almost $13.2 billion. So a lot of money. Next slide, if you will. And a lot of this was to compensate for lower prices. And you can see I've taken this chart from the American Farm Bureau Federation, which just tracked futures prices since pre-COVID time to the present. And you can see that a lot of the prices of commodities dropped. And in some cases, very much, hog prices down 25, 30%. A lot of crops fell, particularly in those early months, March, April, May. But then we began to see some recovery. And the interesting thing to me now is, if we're looking at least here in early October, when these prices were drawn, that for a lot of these commodities now, the prices are above pre-COVID levels. And so the question is, this $23 billion that's now being paid to farmers, at least ostensibly to compensate losses. Certainly there were losses in the early part of that period, but now, how much is this actually should we be looking at in terms of domestic support? Next slide. And if you look at over the last, what this chart shows is just the U.S. trade distorting support. This is the measurement of support which is provided to the WTO. The U.S. has commitments to keep their trade distorting support below $19.1 billion. And you can see over most of the period up until 2019, those first 25 years or so, being in the WTO, the U.S. levels of support have been well below the $19.1 billion. In 2018 and 2019, that started to pick up, and primarily not because of COVID, obviously, but because of the trade war with China and the fact that the current administration, the Trump administration, gave almost $28 billion in 2018 and 2019 to producers. So if you look at it, $28 billion plus the $23 billion that now are being projected over COVID, which will be paid over 2019 crops and 2020 crops. We're also talking, that's all in addition to what producers receive under the Farm Bill and other pieces of standing legislation like the crop insurance program, which is another $10 to $15 billion annually. And on top of that, there are other aid packages, part of the coronavirus package that protected producers who agreed to pay their labor, continue to pay for labor. They could get loans that were essentially, if they paid their producers, those loans would be forgiven, the so-called payroll protection program. And farmers received about $5 billion in that. So if you add all that up and look at that in terms of the arcane rules that exist to classify support and put them reported to the WTO, at least by my calculations, it looks like the US will likely be over in 2019 and 2020. Next slide, please. And so what does that mean by commodity? And you can see in some cases, not only are we talking about a lot of money in terms of, say, something like corn, where if you add up all the amounts of money that are going to corn producers, we're talking somewhere over $10, $11 billion. Also just in terms of the overall value of production, compared to the value of production, the support is quite large. And so the question is, does this stimulate production? Does this insulate producers from lower prices that other producers in the world, particularly in developing countries and others who don't have this sort of assistance, but are forced to make decisions based on market prices? Does this advantage them? Does this advantage the U.S. in one way or another? And I think certainly if you look at some of the implications of this, if you look at individual commodities, there are a lot of developing countries which are very large exporters. You can look at say something like soybeans, where about 62% of the soybean production comes from developing countries. I mean, that would include large developing countries, or I guess upper middle income countries like Brazil and Argentina. Corn, very similar as well. Brazil and others have become very large corn exporters. Cotton, we know, remember we had a WTO case in 2003 that just was resolved finally in 2014 over the level of support U.S. was giving to its cotton producers. And there, you see cotton support at about 42%. Wheat, again, the U.S. is a smaller player in the world wheat market these days, but there too, and rice, 90% of the rice is largely in developing countries. So all these things are important markets, and I think that certainly will cause, has already caused consternation in the WTO. We've seen the two most recent meetings on the Committee on Agriculture. Questions have been raised about this support. And I think the longer run issue, obviously, is, well, what happens moving forward? Is if this is a kind of a one-off thing, that's one thing. If this is looks like a pattern that will be continued, then that may be more of a concern. And currently, there's another coronavirus aid package, very, very large package being debated in US Congress right now, likely will be done after the election, but that could provide even more support to the sector. So it will bear watching. And with that, I think I'll wrap up and send it back to you, Katarla.
Great, thank you, Joe, and thank you to all of our presenters for your insightful presentations. Now we have an opportunity to engage with our live audience through the questions that they've submitted. So I'll encourage you to please continue submitting your questions, and we'll come to them as many of them as we can. Let's start off the Q&A portion with you, Danielle. The presenters talked mainly about formal actors in the political economy, but what about informal political actors like traditional authorities or criminal groups? Have they had any impact on the food policies that we're discussing?
Okay, thanks, Katarla. That's a great question, actually, because of course, yes, we did just focus on kind of formal actors. Well, of course, I don't know what's going on globally. There are a few cases where we have seen criminal actors playing a role. So there have been reports in Brazil, for example, of criminal gangs who often, control some of the favelas, the slum areas, actually being charged with food distribution, and like politicians handing out food baskets with their faces on them in order to be recognized for having a response to that. There's been other negative cases. There's been some cases also in Brazil where you've heard of kind of militia groups forcing markets to stay open, even if there have been government restrictions for them to close, because some of these militia groups actually get a cut from the markets, and so they don't want the markets to close down because they will obviously lose a revenue source. So I'm sure there's many more examples other panelists may know from their various countries, but those are just two examples where we do see criminal actors also playing a role, for good or bad, in these dynamics right now.
Thank you, Danielle. The next question I'll direct to you, Yo. It's coming from Elena, who is a PhD student. Were there cases for restrictions of international food trade caused by COVID policies? And do you think that because of COVID-19, food security should be more closely linked with self-sufficiency by countries?
Okay, well, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, but we have a blog on our website on the initial reactions and the trade interventions, which Joe co-authored on basically the introduction of trade intervention, trade restrictions in response to COVID early on. Most of these export restrictions has been removed over the following months, also in response to a lot of reactions from, as I mentioned already, from WTO, the FAO, World Bank, etc., and the researchers or experts from IFPRI, etc. Now, the broader question is, should food security lead to more emphasis on food self-sufficiency? Well, I think, if you heard the presentations here today, both the presentation from Africa and from Chile, etc., what's clear there is that the big problem is already now and certainly going forward seems to be much more the demand side than the supply side. What does that mean? It's the income losses which is hurting most. And so therefore, I think in anything which is going to make these income losses worse is going to create more problems for food security. Okay? And so that's certainly from that perspective, we should try to make sure that the trade in food keeps going, because that's an important source of income for many poor people in poor developing countries. Another point is that I think if we look at resilience now, looking more on the supply chain side, I think what's important really is the diversity, I think, of potential sources of supply. And therefore, if you want to mitigate the risk going forward, making the system as a whole more resilient, it's important that you can source from different sources. And so I think a combination of domestic sources of supply and international sources is very important. If you're going to focus only on local self-sufficiency, then essentially you're making yourself less resilient, I think, because you will think about there'll be, with climate change, one expects to have more local droughts, more local floods, also things like locust invasion, etc. All these things are going to make, depending on locally produced food only, going to make you less resilient rather than more resilient. And then maybe a last point on that is, there's a lot of discussion right now on whether global or local supply chains have performed better, have been more resilient in the narrow way, if you want, in COVID. I think the jury is very much out on that. I mean, much of what we know is based on ad hoc stories, on media reports, how things have broken down. I think increasingly the information that we're getting now is that in many cases, the supply chains have been, particularly in medium-term perspective, maybe not in the immediate effects, have been more resilient than many people would have predicted. And I think several of the presentations that we heard here today actually are consistent with that. The question is, will it lead to more pressure on self-sufficiency? I think there the answer is probably yes. The political debate, and I think Joe's presentation is a very good illustration of that, that it is actually contributing to more support to domestic sectors, if you want. Okay, I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. Joe, did you want to come in on any of these questions?
I would just echo what Yo said on export restrictions. In fact, we did see a lot in the first 3 or 4 weeks in particular. I think at one point, our tracker was showing some 18 some odd countries that had imposed restrictions, but really those were pretty much gone by the time the harvest started coming in the early spring. And so by the time, midsummer or so, very few countries were still maintaining any sort of restrictions. So far different story than what Yo referred to back in 2007, 2008, or even 2010, 2011. I think I would agree wholeheartedly. I think these systems have shown a great deal of resilience.
Great, thank you, Joe and Yo. Sam, the next question I'll direct to you. The question is, it seems like African governments are spending far more than they can afford. Should they be reducing their expenditures instead of increasing them?
Thank you, Katala. Yeah, it will seem that, but if you look at what African governments are spending now, which is about a quarter of GDP on average, it's much lower than what other governments spent in other regions, some up 40% to 50% of GDP. So what it means is that African governments are already constrained in how much they can spend. And so with shocks such as these, then it makes them put more spending on, or take spending away from the critical investment that will drive long-term growth, like ag R&D, extension, infrastructure, education, etc. So it's more that the government need to spend more, but the question is, where would the resources come from? And so some of the issues that I mentioned at the end, in terms of broadening the revenue base, becomes very, very important, such as, for example, bringing in the informal sector to the formal sector to contribute more to the growth prospect, to employment, to job creation. And even the informal sector can bring in innovation and also up their own productivity and growth prospects. So that is what will create the fiscal space to allow governments to spend more. So definitely governments need to spend more in the critical investment. The question is the resources to do that. Thank you, Katala.
Great, thank you, Sam. Astrid, I'll direct the next question to you. In your remarks, you briefly touched on the idea of the rural safety net. Could you expand more on how you see this working to support food insecure urban residents?
Yeah, thanks, Katala. So I think, the interesting part of at least the African urbanization stories that we see a general sort of circular flow of migration in many places. It's not just, people move to the city and then that's it. As I said, they often maintain a home and very strong links to rural areas. And we don't, I'm glad the last question was directed at Sam, because that was quite a complicated question. But the point is that the fiscal space to respond like many countries responded, which was to provide like a lot of consumption or production support, just doesn't exist. We weren't able to do that. So, on the one hand, we did the lockdowns. On the other hand, we didn't have the fiscal measures to support people through those lockdowns. So then, the thinking about the rural safety net is, well, if you don't have the fiscal measures to support people through those lockdowns, how can people really support themselves? And food, as I said, being a very critical issue, and access to food is, you can in many, not in all countries by any means, but in, for example, my own country, being able to go to the rural area, farm, being able to eat is a very sort of key critical thing. Now, again, here you have the selection. So, I think we've seen there's studies, I think, in Bangladesh that have been carried out, and, a small subsidy that, the government could provide to provide transport. You would have to ensure that it's done safely, with all the sanitation measures. You'd also have to make sure that you have adequate surveillance measures, perhaps through community health workers, to ensure that you don't create outbreaks or spreads of outbreaks in terms of COVID-19 in rural areas. But I think importantly that the part about this is that people need to self-select, because as we saw with the food aid distribution, being able to identify is a really, really difficult but critical piece. And so it's not that you want to incentivize people to move to rural areas and then create a stress in rural areas. You want it to be just enough to be able to ensure that those who need to go and have a place to be absorbed in can go, but not that suddenly everyone moves from the city to the rural area. But I think these are mechanisms that we see play out anyway in crises. It's just that this particular crisis, as a pandemic, it wasn't a possible mechanism because of the lockdown. But I think in terms of longer term thinking, how you can support people to support themselves is a really important question that governments need to ask themselves.
Great, thank you. Ashok, the next question for you, coming from Monique, is there a risk of elite capture of food production distribution chains? How are small scale farmers going to be protected against elite capture?
The question of who is going to build the supply lines, we have a classic example of milk, I said. You have the poultry example. And all these small holders have become a part of those supply lines. There is Nestle's of the world, and there is Hudson of the world, which is largest private sector dairies. And they are working with the smallest farmers with 2 cows and 4 cows. So I think the Indian model has to be inclusive, because the agriculture farmer is a small holder. Average holding size is just 1.08. When you talk of the bargaining power, it's not with individual farmer everybody is going to sign a contract. It is with farmer producer organizations. So there could be 1,000 members and so on and so forth. So the experience in milk, in poultry, does not suggest that there is sort of a monopoly rent in the bargaining power that has been captured on that front. So I'm quite hopeful. Information asymmetry, if you remove, farmers are quite aware of where the best prices they can get. But there is the other part, which is the government-dominated part, which is where the capturing is. And that is where the Food Corporation of India, when they buy, their labor gets 6 to 8 times higher wages than the market wage rate. So this is how you build inefficient structures, and then you have to sell it to the poor consumer at a much lower cost, and massive subsidies have to be given. So I think this system where the private sector is encouraged will challenge the public sector dominated, which is highly inefficient sector, and that competition will start on this side. So having said this on the agriculture marketing front, I think that doesn't mean there weren't any problems. I'm hearing other panelists speaking about consumers, and Indian migrants face the maximum challenge. More than 10 million migrants, went back to their native places. And when the trains were stopped, flights were stopped, the buses were stopped, and they started literally walking or going on their bicycles and so on and so forth. It was a pathetic situation on that front. That led to a major change. And I go back to yours thing, that how a crisis can be turned into an opportunity for reform. Country's leadership felt that if you have ration, but the migrants don't have that ration card with them, they can't draw when they're in the other state. So from that, the government came up with a scheme, one nation, one ration card. So you will have POS machines with your fingerprinting. You can draw your, entitled subsidized grain anywhere in the country. Now, this is a massive reform on the consumer front, giving him food security when he is mobile in any state. So I think these one nation, one agriculture market on the marketing side reform, and one nation, one ration card for the poor consumer, 800 million poor consumers for whom this, ration, which is 90% plus subsidy on that. So I think these are the two major reforms that have been taken up. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Carlos, for you, what should be the priorities for agricultural policies to face the impacts of COVID-19 and in the medium term after the sanitary crisis? Carlos, you're muted.
It's okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. No, I think we will have a number of main challenges in the next time for the agriculture and food policy. If we start off the base of that we will not come back to a situation like business as usual, we will need to go ahead in a sort of recovery with transformation. And in my opinion, the main challenges for the agriculture policy and the food policy, in the case of Chile, but probably in the case of most countries, Latin America, at least South America, is to recover employment, to recover the trends to reduce rural poverty, and in terms of production, to go ahead in a more sustainable way to agriculture production, facing the consequences of the climate change. I really think that after this crisis, we will have in the main agenda for the next time the crisis of the climate change, and is having now a deep impact in the agriculture sector, in the structure of production and so on. I think a second main challenges will be linked to the to go to more healthy food system organization. In case of Latin America, it's cheaper to consume malnutrition food and to get good food, healthy, etc., is extremely expensive. So I think this is a challenge both for the agriculture policies and for the health policies. And linked to that, I think a next discussion about the agriculture policy will be linked to health and new regulations to promote more healthy food system production. And I would like to remark as well that a big challenge, not only for the agriculture sector, for the whole economy, is to discuss about the tax structure. In my opinion, we will need a very important transformation of our tax system, going to a more progressive system. I think it will be in the next time, this year, the next one, a very, very important discussion in Chile. But it's also the situation in countries like Peru or like Ecuador, or even like Argentina or Paraguay. So I think we will have a number of main issues for agriculture and food system that we will need to discuss. And I am really convinced that it will be a strong discussion with, I am not sure what will be the political economy result of this, but I am convinced that we need to go very deep in this discussion the next time.
Great. Thank you very much, Carlos. Danielle, the next question is coming to you from Lillian with Power Shift Africa based in Kenya. Her question is, the pandemic has emphasized the negative impacts of gender inequalities in agriculture. How can we better engender our agriculture and food policies?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question since we didn't really touch on gender very much thus far. But I think particularly on the food policy side, I mean, I think again, this is where it comes to the importance of the informal economy, because a majority of those employed in the informal economy are women, particularly those in kind of the fresh fruits, vegetables sector. And so I think our efforts to try to make the informal economy more robust as a result of this pandemic, considering more ways about how we actually invest in infrastructure, including childcare facilities in the market. Some countries do have this, and it actually, you know, allows women to come to the markets and not have to worry about, you know, leaving their children at home or leaving them in unsafe circumstances. So thinking about how we can make markets safer, cleaner, and also dealing with some of the quite complex institutional arrangements that informal traders encounter, including both kind of complex food safety regimes, different taxation authorities that ask them for various fees, and also different types of harassment by police officers and municipal authorities. So as I said in my earlier remarks, I mean, I think the pandemic's really highlighted the challenges that the sector faces, and hoping that as we're trying to solve a public health crisis, that we're actually being open-minded to the other types of bottlenecks that this sector has encountered for a long time, including many of the disadvantages for women working in this sector.
Thank you. Astrid, you wanted to comment as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I mean Danielle has said most of the things that I wanted to say, but I wanted to sort of highlight, I think, two important points. You mentioned it sort of as your last remark, Danielle, but it's interesting because at least sort of when we think about urban policy, COVID-19 hasn't really resulted in any new policy recommendations. It's mostly just highlighted and increased the urgency of many of the things that we've been seeing before. And I think in the informal sector, that is one of them. I mean, you know, not only, Danielle, as you've really clearly highlighted, to support women who make up a large proportion of this sector, but also, as Sam mentioned in his previous comments, about sort of bringing them into the formal space as well from a revenue perspective, and from a just even being able to, as I said in my comments, sort of to know who they are in the data perspective. The other thing I wanted to just highlight, which is interesting in thinking about particularly the women informal food vendors that Danielle was referring to in relation to this pandemic, is that there is so often these, you know, the data I was talking about before, there is so often the sole employed traders. So I think 73% of single businesses in Kampala, single businesses in the informal sector, single person businesses in the informal sector in Kampala are female run. But interestingly, it also helps decentralize food production. So in a pandemic, when you're not trying to get everyone to come to one place because of overcrowding, this is actually potentially an advantage we can use of this very decentralized nature of some of the trade that goes on from the informal sector and in the food system, that could also be explored. But obviously with all the implications and the safety nets that Danielle has mentioned.
Great, thank you. We just have a couple minutes left, and so Joe, I wanted to bring the last question to you. What are other developed countries doing to help producers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katarla. There are, as I said at the beginning, there are a number of countries that have provided support to their producers, because producers have been hit very, very hard by this in terms of disruptions in supply chain. I think most of the support that I've seen, and a lot of this has been reported to the WTO, and so it's not entirely transparent, but you can get a pretty good idea of what other countries have been doing, have been on the order of helping improving transportation sector, improving storage subsidies, for example, to allow producers to you know, smooth some of the sales of their commodities, so they're able to wait until prices recover a bit. Again, these are pretty small compared to the support levels that the U.S. has provided, but I think nonetheless they are significant and have been mainly aimed at giving producers more flexibility and the marketing chain in general more flexibility to deal with the crisis.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. And thank you to all of our speakers and to our audience for tuning in. We are out of time, but we very much appreciate the questions that you've submitted. Stay safe, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.